Ted Adams, and this is the Weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. So here we are in the 5th episode of the series. I decided to skip over the Spanish-American War and a few other relatively minor engagements and head straight into the nightmarish world of trenches, machine guns, and poison gas. I'll go ahead and give a mild content warning here, as there will be some descriptions of the war that some people may find upsetting. I think World War I occupies an interesting space in military history. It kind of stands in this nether region between the semi-romantic chivalry of bygone eras and the horror of modern industrial warfare. I mean, up in the sky you had modern-day knights jousting on mechanical flying horses, such a new form of warfare that at the beginning, pilots were often just shooting their own pistols at each other. In Beersheba, you saw some of the last true horse soldiers engage in a successful charge against entrenched machine guns and artillery. But elsewhere, you saw the mechanization of warfare cause so many casualties to mount up over such a short period of time that the numbers are sometimes really hard to fathom. During the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army took over 50,000 casualties, almost 20,000 of them killed, and most of them were killed in the first hour. The wonders of modern science were leveraged to figure out new ways to kill men in strong entrenched defenses. Heavier than air poison gases like chlorine, phosgene, and mustard killed over 90,000 soldiers during the war. The brutality of chemical warfare was extreme. Chlorine gas hydrolyzes in the lungs, turning into hypochlorous and hypochloric acid. In addition to hydrolyzing into acids, phosgene disrupts the blood-air barriers within your lungs' alveoli, leading to suffocation or, more unfortunately, drowning due to internal bleeding. Mustard gas was unique in that it caused an alkylation of DNA, sort of similar to what chemotherapy does to cancer cells, except mustard worked on every cell it came in contact with. Either way, there was nothing chivalrous about killing with or dying of poison gas. For the United States, this was our first large-scale military involvement beyond the borders of the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. was not initially all that eager to get involved. Heck, President Woodrow Wilson campaigned for re-election at least partially on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." As such, the Army of 1916 was only 108,000 men, equaling about 0.1% of the American population. You can certainly see a trend up to this point. In May of 1917, though, the United States Congress passed the Selective Service Act, requiring men ages 21 to 30 to register for the draft, and later in 1918 was expanded to men ages 18 to 45. 2 months later, the first draft lottery started the process of growing the Army from a little over 100,000 to over 400,000 by the end of the year, and at the height of the war, the Army would grow to almost 2.4 million. I can't imagine those growing pains. But the good news in all of this is that many of your male ancestors alive at the time would have either been in that 2.4 million, or the many million more who had to register for the drafts. But before we get into that, first, as always, it helps to understand the war and the forces involved. Now, World War I was an absolute monster of a conflict. Unless you're just interested in the topic, I wouldn't really recommend reading a history of the entire war, although there are several good ones. My favorite is actually a history of the peace agreement called A Peace to End All Peace by David Fromkin. It's really just an excellent read, but again, not really what you need for our purposes. Now, I know that I've got listeners to the podcast from several different nations, with notable audiences in the UK and Australia, but I'll have to admit here, when it comes to military research, I'm almost exclusively experienced in American research. So while I know that this was kind of your war, I'm going to recommend the book Over There, The United States and the Great War, 1917 to 1918 by Byron Farwell. Large chunks of the book approach the war from a social history perspective, which I think is interesting for those of us whose primary interest is in genealogy rather than in military history generally. For an understanding of the Army, there's a few sources, all freely available from the Army's Center of Military History. The first two are Order of Battle of the United States Land Forces in the World War and The United States Army in the World War, 1917 to 1919, published by the Center in 1988. They're not something that you grab a warm cup of tea and sit down next to the fire and read, but they are good references for understanding the organization of the bulk of the American Expeditionary Forces. There is also a relatively short and very readable collection entitled The U.S. Army in the World War I Era that will provide you some good Army-focused context, both before and during the war. I'm a little light on my books on naval history, but the Naval History and Heritage Command's website has a number of interesting articles, one of them about the Navy in the 1918 pandemic, which I think is pretty interesting. So, okay, you've gotten your context and you want to move forward. What sort of records should you be looking for? Well, I would start with the easiest to find records, the draft records. These are already available online, and many of you will have already found several, I'm guessing. Family Search, Ancestry, Fold3, MyHeritage, and probably others all have draft records that you can search. But you might want to understand a bit more about the records. First of all, just because you found a draft record does not mean that your ancestor was drafted into service. Roughly 24 million men registered for the draft, but the entire U.S. military only topped out at just under 3 million. The draft occurred over 3 periods, with the first targeting men between 21 and 31 on June 5, 1917. The second registration was a year later and targeted the men who had turned 21 since the first registration. And the final registration in September of 1918 ended up capturing the data of all men from 18 to 45. Each of the registrations produced slightly different registration cards that had slightly different questions. I like to start here simply because they're usually pretty easy to find, and there's some really good information that you probably want to have. But, like I said, just because you have a draft registration doesn't mean that they served. If you have a suspicion that your ancestor did serve, either from family lore or you've gotten some old artifacts, or maybe you've seen the 1930 or 1940 censuses, or perhaps you've even seen that he has a government-provided headstone, or that his headstone simply says something like, Private, World War I. You'll probably want to at least give a shot at looking for his official military personnel files. That's sort of like the compiled service records that we've seen before, although instead of being abstracts of other records, the OMPF for short is the actual file of records. These records are available at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. But I've got a bit of bad news for you. As a result of a fire in 1973, 80% of their Army personnel records ranging from 1912 to 1960 were lost. So, the chances that you're going to find much are relatively low, but in some cases, some documents like discharge papers were kept separately from the rest of the OMPF and may be available. It's worth at least submitting a request, and I'll leave a link in the description that will take you through that process step by step. Some states have records for their National Guard units that were deployed for the war, so you might be able to find something there. But it's unlikely that it'll be much more than muster rolls or service cards that have a sort of brief summary of their service. Certainly useful, but not the motherlode. Some states also commissioned historical reports after the war that had their soldiers fill out questionnaires with lots of useful genealogical information, but not much of military interest beyond their enlistment date and what unit they served in, and possibly if they had been wounded. You could also have a look at the U.S. Army Transport Service arriving and departing passenger lists available on Ancestry. These are passenger manifests for the troop ships that took the soldiers overseas. They're good to find, but again, they won't have much beyond the name and service number of your ancestor and the names and addresses of their next of kin. As for pension records, Veterans Affairs claim files are available in the National Archives at St. Louis, which can have a treasure trove of information. If your ancestor at some point became too feeble to care for himself, he may have ended up in a soldier's home. These were sort of early versions of the VA or state veterans nursing homes. There are several states that have records for these homes available online at Family Search and Ancestry. There are a number of unit histories that might help you gain a better understanding of what your ancestor likely did during the war. Many of these are fairly high-level histories of divisional units, but even then, you'll at least have a sense of where on the battlefield they served and what major battles they may have been a part of. Many of these histories are also old enough that you can find them for free at places like the Internet Archive or Family Search. Finally, veteran societies are an interesting place to go looking for information. These were organizations that provided social support and, in some cases, may have advocated for veterans' benefits after the war. The Veterans of Foreign Wars was founded in 1899, and the American Legion came into being as a result of World War I. There's also the Order of the First World War, which was organized by veterans in 1948 as a fraternal organization. Some have online archives that let you look through some of their organizational documents like newsletters, magazines, chapter minutes, and that sort of thing. We're getting near to the end of the Military Records series. I hadn't really started out planning on doing a series, but I felt like I couldn't really cover everything that I wanted to in a single episode. But now it kind of feels like I'm doing a military history podcast. If this isn't your bag of tea, hang in there. It won't be long till I get back to looking at other genealogy tips, but if you are enjoying it, I hope you've learned something that you can use. As always, you can reach out to me on Twitter at the WGT Pod. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.